Is that better? Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I guess I have the pleasure of the after-lunch session. Well, I'm here to talk about WCF RIA services and how you can use that. One of the big themes for Silverlight 4, is there an echo? Or do I just feel it? All right. One of the big themes for Silverlight 4 is line of business applications and getting the platform ready and having the right building blocks for building enterprise applications, data-driven applications, end-tier applications. And one of the key technologies in that sort of theme is WCF RIA services, amongst a slew of other technologies in that space. I think Scott Guthrie had a slide up on the keynote with several technologies, and he actually called out WCF RIA services. And one of the things unique about RIA services is it spans both the client on top of Silverlight today and on the server on top of ASP.NET middle-tier server. And like most applications, applications tend to span, they have a server component to them and a client component to them, increasingly so going forward. And so this technology tries to bring the two worlds together as a whole, as a single thing. In terms of an agenda, I actually have a fairly packed agenda. Also realize this is a 60-minute slot, and so I'm going to try and go through a bunch of content. We'll see how that goes. I want to show a little bit of an introduction to RIA services. Quick show of hands, how many people have used RIA services? We've been putting out betas since last MIX, so quite a few of you. That's great to see. And so I'll show a little bit of intro, and then I'll show a couple of other things I want to touch on, which is using RIA services with MVVM or ViewModel. Another sort of question, how many people use ViewModel? Wow, that's great to see, lots of you. How many people have heard about ViewModel but haven't used it yet? A few hands, great, okay. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of introduction here, but there's also a couple of talks at the conference on getting started with ViewModel. I think they already happened yesterday, so you might want to catch that on the video. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the things to think about when you're designing your application and your application logic, and how RIA services provides building blocks for you to take your thoughts and your designs and translate that into actual code. Along the way, I'll have some tips and guidelines. I'll recap them at the end. And I hope there'll be time. I have a sneak peek of a demo that I want to do about things that might happen in the future. So before we start, like I alluded to, RIA services spans client and server. We wanted to simplify end-tier development where you are developing on both tiers. In fact, with Silverlight, you're forced to develop end-tier applications because you don't typically you're not able to talk directly to the database in most of the cases. And so you're forced to deal with things like asynchronous data access, how much data to bring down, how to track what the user's done, how to submit the changes back, how to write the services, how to create proxies, update proxies, how to write binding code so that you can take your data and actually show it in the UI and data bind into the UI. So there's a lot of infrastructure code that you have to write, and what we really want to do with the RIA services was build that infrastructure into the framework so that you don't have to focus on that sort of boilerplate plumbing code, and instead you can go focus on your application on both the server and the client. It's a higher level framework, so we build on a number of existing technologies that are in the framework today. Link is a big one that kind of crosses the tier in terms of how to do data access. WCF is another very important technology. We're built on top of WCF. It's in fact called WCF RIA services. And so you have the full power of WCF underneath if you want to go below and customize how your services work. But you can also work at a higher level where you focus on your code and not on the service infrastructure. And last but not least, we have a bunch of data access technologies, and we like every data access technology. In particular, we have Entity Framework, we have Link to SQL, there's third-party data access technologies like NHibernate. All of these are interesting, and you can use them with RIA services. So I did an experiment this time, and I actually posted a blog post, that's the URL, asking what people would like to see. One theme that emerged was pick a real-world scenario, skip the drag drop. Everyone agree? I don't see many hands. Oh, great. So I'm going to skip the drag drop. I'm going to actually minimize my time in the design. I'm going to show more of code. But more interestingly, there are some specific things that people were looking for. How do you create an application where the UI is not mapped to a single table? How do you do projections? How do you do things where different set of types are passed to the client rather than the DAL types directly? How do you store procs? How do you use invoke? And you'll see that in a moment what I mean by invoke, as opposed to CRUD operations. Some very specific things like how do I implement a lookup combo box came up. And then another sort of theme was how do I use RIA services with ViewModel. And so I'll try to cover some of these. The realization I had after the fact was picking a trying to pick a real world demo. A, it doesn't actually fit in an R, and B, even if you try, you still have lots of content. And so bear with me. I hope that there'll be time for Q&A afterwards if something was unclear. But with that, let me skip to a demo. So I'm going to, let me remove this breakpoint. I'm going to show you an application first, and then I'll build parts of it. All right? So I picked a real-world scenario in the sense I'm a very frequent and regular user of the Microsoft library. We have a great library. And so I thought, why not kind of pick a book theme? And I started with the library, but and then later transformed it to a book club. So imagine we're on the RIA services team, and if you walk around the offices at Microsoft, people have bookshelves full of books. And so it would be nice to be able to share them amongst your colleagues. And so I have a little book club app where you can see books of the day, similar books. You can look at what's been recently added to the book club by different people, what the status is. So like this is available. This thing's checked out to someone. There's a couple books that are checked out and have requests. It's a popular book. I can search. So for example, search for a link. And I see a book on Essential Link. And so this is sort of the browsing end. If I'm logged in, I can go ahead and place a request. And down here it says your request was recorded. I guess it's very small. But if I refresh this query, now there's 3 requests. So that's sort of the if you're browsing the set of books that are available. I might also have my own bookshelf that I'm contributing, sharing books. And so I have my bookshelf. I can load some books. And it's loaded some books that I've, let's say, shared out with my colleagues. I can go ahead and edit this book. I can go ahead and share another book. So let's actually just do that. And of course, I should have had the webcam integration, right, so that I can go scan a barcode. But unfortunately, I don't have that today. That will make for a great future rev of this demo. And so I'm going to, let's say, take this book from Rocky. He's written a great book on business objects, and copy that stuff. That's the other thing with a demo that validates everything you do. I have to actually enter stuff that makes sense. Let's enter that, and finally, sort of an ISBN-like number. So I can go ahead and do that, click OK. That book's showing up over here. It's showing up down in this list here with a little green marker saying that this is a book that I've added. I haven't submitted any changes yet, so let me go ahead and press save. And that book just got saved. The green indicator went away. If I had an error while entering this, if there was some server-side validation that failed, that green error would become red. Let's just try that. So I'll just enter whatever, random stuff. Other things to notice, this thing turned red because there's a little bit of validation on the client saying, hey, this description needs to be a sentence of sorts. Well, it doesn't actually check that it makes sense. And I'll enter in a number that doesn't resolve into an actual book. So I'll enter an ABCD over here, click OK. Same thing again over here, it shows up as added. Go ahead and hit save. There was an error because that entry didn't make any sense. And you'll see this thing shows up as red on the bottom, that there was an error, indicate sort of feedback. and this error, this thing came back from the server because the server tried to resolve this ID to an actual book against Amazon, right? And so that failed and came back. So this is the app, and what I'm going to be focusing on for the demo is talk a little bit about sort of the My Bookshelf part of the thing, where I can browse my books, add books, edit books, and then I'll show you the other half of the book, other half of the app where you're browsing books, and it kind of shows some interesting scenarios what you can do with RIA services. So let's open up a different solution. So I've got a solution in sort of just sort of started. I've got a server application, which is an ASP.NET application, and I've got a Silverlight application. These two are linked. Again, RIA Services looks at the end-to-end picture, and so these two projects are part of a single application called the Book Club application, right? This Silverlight application gets deployed into the website, and then it runs from there. I have a data model. Let's look at that. So I'm using Entity Framework, but like I said before, your favorite data access technology will work here. That includes StoreProx and includes direct ADO.NET SQL client if you're not using an ORM. So what I have in my data model is, as you might imagine, a book table, a category table for the categories that the books are in, a members table, which is all the members of the book club, and then a couple of tables like request and checkout, which track the activity of the members in the book club, right? So this is my data model. Nothing too complicated, but you'll see that this is a fairly interesting model in terms of how you think about it and what you do with it in RIA Services and how you project it to the client. So let me close that. And let's start with something that's RIA Services specific. I'll go ahead and add a domain service. This is the first thing. This is sort of probably the key concept in RIA Services. This is sort of the things where things center around. And I'll call it bookshelf service. So I'm modeling a bookshelf. That's what my functionality is, and correspondingly, I'm naming my domain service bookshelf service. I'm getting this wizard that says, hey, it noticed an Entity Framework model, and so I'll pick book, and I'll enable editing. Go ahead and say OK. And it generates this code here, a bookshelf service that derives from link to entities domain service. So we have a base class called domain service, which you can use if you are using any arbitrary data access technology. We have a specialized derived class called link to entities domain service that adds some helper functionality if you're specifically using Entity Framework. And what a domain service contains is CRUD operations. So sort of query operations like get books that returns an iQueryable of book, insert book, update book, and delete book. Now, I want to stress this, and I want to stress this really hard. This is a starting point. This domain service wizard produces a starting point. This is wizard code that is intended for your modification because your application is going to be unique. You're going to have some interesting logic. That's what we're writing an application for. So as you'll see, I'll be modifying this a little bit as we go along. First thing I'll do is actually go ahead and add an ordering to this. So in Entity Framework, nothing's ordered by default. And so the question is, what is the ordering that makes sense for this application? I chose that the most recent book should appear first, right? So no wizard could have guessed that, right? So I'll say order by the added date, and we're ready to go. So I have a domain service. It's got some basic CRUD, no specific application logic, but I'll come back to this later. We'll kind of do a breadth-first approach at building some of the client first. So let me just build this to make sure everything's good to go. And open up my client. So what I have is some UI already done, just in the interest of time. It's got the list of books that will show up over here, the details form that shows up over here, and the load and save buttons over here up at the top. And so what I want to do right here is load some data. So I'll double-click this load button, which takes me to the click event handler. And right off the bat, what I can do is I have this object called bookshelf context. And it's based on the fact that I wrote a bookshelf service. And now it appeared there because these two projects are part of a single application, so you have direct access to this. There's nothing really magical going on. I mean, it's if you look at, there's a folder called generated code, and this is where we generate a bunch of objects based on what you had on the server. So specifically, I have bookshelf context, which is over here, and I'll show you what's in there in just a second. And I have a book, which is what I'm exposing, and it has all the members of book, right? So I can program against these without having to go add a service, without having to go create a proxy, without having to think about URIs. I can just start newing this up. And what's on this is, so first and foremost, there's a member called books. Now, the way we knew about that was because I wrote a query method called getBooks that returns a list of books, right? So we have a property called books. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is bind it to my list box. Now, I haven't brought down any books, and nothing comes automatically from the server to the client in terms of actual data. We've brought down the type definitions, but not the actual data. Because we think it's important for you to think about when you bring data down, what data you bring down. Those are interesting things that you should think about when developing an application. So I can go ahead and still bind to it, and what this collection will do, as data is fetched from the server, the collection will raise change notifications that the list box will pick up, and it'll actually start displaying items in the list box, right? So you don't have to think about the async sort of completion. The underlying infrastructure will just take care of it. And now when the load button is clicked, I want to go ahead and actually perform some loading. So we have this thing called entity query that I'll talk about in just a second, which you can create off of the bookshelf context. So I have get books query, and this corresponds to the get books method query method that I wrote on the server. Now this query object is an actual query that I can use to go load some data. I can hold on to this query object, use it multiple times. I can make changes to this query, as you'll see in just a second. But fundamentally, it's there to define the query that you want to run and take the results and load them into the bookshelf context, right? So bookshelf context.load book query. And let's just run this at this point. It's not a good sign. Oh, there you go. All right, so it brought down a whole bunch of books, right? These are all the books that are in the database, because remember, I went in my service, I said return all books, right? So it's showing me all books. Now, my database is a toy database. It has about 60 books. In a real-world application, in a real-world database, you're going to have thousands, possibly many thousands of entries, and you almost never want to bring down everything, right? Even if it has no cost in terms of time and bandwidth, a user probably doesn't want to scroll through that many number of records. So we want to do a little bit of paging. So that I can bring things in chunks. Now I said this entity query is a query object, and I can now use link. I can say book query equals .take 5. And so what I've just done is modified the query that I want to run to say just take the top 5, right? And if I run this, you'll see I just got back five books back. Now what's happening behind the scenes is we're taking this query that you wrote, serializing the link expression onto the URI, sending that to the server. On the server, we invoke this method. This method happens to return an iQueryable that says the query hasn't been executed yet on the middle tier. It still represents an actual query. We take the incoming query, compose it on top of the query returned from this method, and then send it to the database, which is where it gets executed. So you're fetching just 5 books all the way from the database, creating those 5 books on the middle tier, serializing them to the client, and getting 5 books on the client. So it goes all the way. Now, of course, that's a very simple scenario for a link. I can do certainly more complicated things. For example, I had the search text box, and I want to filter that, use that as a filter. So let me go ahead and so here's some. I guess I need to add a couple variables. I'll move my entity query object over here as a member, and I'll add a page index. So what I'm doing here now, whenever the load button is clicked, I'm going to start on page 0. Why is it? I'm going to rename this. So whenever the load button is clicked, I'm going to get the first page of data. I'm going to use the search text box. If there's an entry in the text box, I'm going to go ahead and compose that a where clause into the query, so where the title contains the search text. And this can be more complicated. I can say, title contains search text, or description contains search text, and so on and so forth. And then take 5, because this is the first page. I'm going to clear the existing books that I've brought down. So if I keep hitting load and keep searching for different things, all the results are going to get accumulated. But I only want to see results for the last search term that I entered. So I'm going to clear any books that I've brought down, and then go ahead and load that query. Now, I have a More button in the UI, and that's going to be my paging. So I'm not doing next previous. I'm not doing a specific page number. I'm showing, for the purpose of demonstration, a different style of paging, which is sort of more. You kind of add to the bottom, and you have a scroll bar instead, right? And so when the More button is clicked, I'm going to say load some more data. So specifically what I'm doing is incrementing the page index, taking that book query. Remember I said this book query is an actual object you can hold on to? So I've just created this book query over here, and or right here, and it actually holds on to the fact that that was the filter that you were applying, the search text that you had applied. And hereafter, all I'm doing is adding the paging. I'm still retaining the fact that it's filtered to whatever I entered, right? So I'm skipping to the right page and then taking 5 again, and then loading that. And this time, I'm not clearing the bookshelf, so the results are going to get appended at the bottom, right? Let's run. Actually, let's do this as well. So I loaded 5. If I click more, it's going to load 5 more, and I get a scroll bar, right? Now I want to, let's say, do a search. Let's say I search for photography. Say load. That clears the past results, so I'm not seeing those past results anymore. I get 5 new results, and I click more, and it gets me, well, there's one more. So it just picked that one. And I also just hooked up selection. So whenever the list box changes selection, I set the book editor's book property. This control here is the book editor to the selected book. And so I can click that, and it shows me the selected book. All right? So that's a quick pass at sort of doing queries where I have a query method defined in the domain service and using the context in the client to load data. I guess I want to show one other thing. So I assumed the client's taking 5 at a time, right? And this works from your client. But now the thing to keep in mind is when you wrote a service, you're actually creating a service that someone else might hit as well, especially if you put it on the public internet, a service, right, where they might not be using your client. And so if someone were to hit this, you're going to return all books. And if you had lots of records, you're going to have a bunch of work on the CPU, on the server, to bring down that data from the database, create those books, and send it to the client. So you might want to say, as the service developer, I have an upper bound. Like, you can take as many as the upper bound, but no more, right? And so one of the features we have is a option on the query method, and you can specify that by putting a query attribute and saying result limit equals 5. So if the client asks for 5, great, nothing doesn't get in the way. If the client asks for, let's say, 10, you're still going to get back 5. If the client asks for all, you're still going to get 5, because the server developer said at most 5. Now, of course, if you're publishing this as a service, you're probably going to tell people that, by the way, the limit is 5, which is very typical of any web service out there. And by the way, you need to use paging to get to the nth page, right? So that's a quick overview of using a domain service. Let's skip the slides, and then I'll come back and show the editing part. Just to recap, so on the server, what I wrote was a domain service which contains stateless, CRUD, and application logic. So I have query methods, update, insert, delete methods. We'll see this as we go in the demo, validation rules, authorization rules, and so on. I've got my data model, like my book class, defined on the server. At design time, we look at that. We look at metadata and generate a domain context on the client, which represents a stateful view. So I brought books down, and it holds on to those books. It accumulates books as I bring them down and makes them available for data binding into the UI. So that's this books property. And for every query method, I have a query method on my domain context. And then I have entities like the book class on the client as well, so that I can hold on to the data that I brought down. At runtime, essentially what happens is the client creates queries, calls context.load, passing in the query. And later we'll see you can make changes and call context.submit changes. And those queries and changes are sent back to the server, where the domain service infrastructure calls into the right methods and executes the queries, processes changes. So shifting gears just a little bit, I wanted to talk about ViewModel, and what I'll be doing is I'll be showing the editing functionality in the context of a ViewModel-based client. What I was doing so far was in my code behind, not in a ViewModel, and we'll talk about this. So I saw many hands go up when I asked about how many people are using ViewModel, and it's basically a pattern for separating out your UI from your interesting application logic, for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason really is to facilitate sort of designers and developers working together. And you might happen to be a designer and developer, but there are different things you're doing at different points in time, right? So you can focus on your UI while you're working on your UI. You can focus on your application logic while you're working on the code. So it sort of facilitates that. And the view model basically encapsulates the state and operations of your application. And I'll show you this with a diagram in just a bit. Hopefully it'll be clearer. And the long-term sort of benefits of view model is your code and design are both more maintainable. You can change your code. You can do different things. You can call different query methods, for example, on your domain service. But as long as you produce the same data, your view doesn't have to go change. On the flip side, the designer might come along and say, well, this list UI doesn't make sense for a bookshelf. It should really look like a bookshelf, right? And the designer can go ahead and do that and completely change the UI. As long as the view model is producing a list of books, that can be consumed, and the designer is happy and can kind of experiment and differentiate your UI. And last but not least, you can take your view model, which is completely independent of your UI, and simulate user input and validate that the right things are happening, that the right queries are happening, and the right data is being brought down. So to kind of give an overview of this pattern, we have presentation logic, which is either XAML and code behind. You have your view model, which is your application state, your operations, and any change notifications. And then you have your data model, which is your services and so on, and so your business rules. And the way the view model pattern works is you take an instance of the view model and use it as the data context for your UI. And data binding is an extremely powerful sort of tool in Silverlight. So you can bind parts of your UI to different parts of your view model. Like, for example, if my view model has a books property, I can have my items controls, item source bound to the books. If I have a load books method on my view model, which is an operation, I can bind the buttons command to the load command, which invokes that method, right? And this logic here doesn't need to know anything about the fact that it was the UI calling it, and it doesn't have any dependencies on the UI. It, in turn, sort of depends on the data model. And that's where RIA services kind of provides a domain context which you can then go use from your view model. And you can encapsulate your use of that domain context inside that view model. All right? So the way I actually like to think visually, and we kind of do this all the time on whiteboards. We kind of draw a sketch and kind of scribble around on it and talk about it amongst different, especially if you have a team. And so one of the things we can do with something like Sketchflow is when you have those sketches, you can actually start using them to think about what your view model actually is. So I did this experiment, and here's a sketch of the application, sort of roughly equivalent. Let's kind of put the sketch in the background and actually call out the different pieces of state that your application has that's being visualized and the different operations that your application exposes that users can sort of trigger or invoke in some way. So I've got my books collection, and I've got my selected book. The selected book's bound two ways, so it updates the view model whenever the user makes a selection. And then I've got my details also bound to that selected book. So that's the interesting state in my view model, or in my application. And then I've got a few operations. Like I've got load books, load more books, save books, share a book, unshare a book, edit book. You haven't seen some of them, but that's what's in this application. And so if I were to go look at this diagram and put that into sort of a class diagram, that's essentially a view model. It almost identically maps. I mean, there's other things in this view model that I haven't called out in the UI, just to keep it less busy. But that really is your view model. And so you can kind of start from this diagram to kind of get into view model. So with that, let's actually see that in action. So let's go back to the client. And again, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just a little bit of demo magic. So here's my view model. A view model is basically a class that raises, it's any class that raises property change notifications, at least raises change notifications. And rather than implement iNotify property change in this class, I just have a base class called viewModelBase that does a little bit of the boilerplate in terms of raising events and implementing an event. And then here's my interesting state. I've got my books. I've got my selected book. Whenever the selected book changes, I raise a property change. And that's the method exposed by my viewModelBase class. And then I've got my methods: load books, load more books, share book, so on and so forth. Right? So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is do a little bit of cleanup, because I'm kind of starting from code behind, and I want to switch gears and do view model. So I'm going to remove some of this stuff. I don't need this stuff anymore in my code behind, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And this is, again, just demo. Realistically, you would never have this code here. These are just stub event handlers, just so I don't have to change the XAML and remove all the event handlers, right? But what I'm going to go ahead and do, more importantly, is actually set my data context to new bookshelf view model. So what this just did is connect the view to its view model, right? So anything that's being exposed by the view model is now going to be bindable into the view, right? Now, what I want to go ahead and do is go to my XAML, and I want to do a couple of things. And I'll talk about these because these are probably the most interesting part about this view model and how the hookup happens. So I'm telling the designer that the data context is of type bookshelf view model. What this will do is it'll tell the designer what are the types of properties and methods that you have, so that the data binding pickers, all of that kind of stuff works. So let me build this, make sure it's all okay. Okay. So let's pick my list box and go to the properties window. And here's item source. So I'm going to say apply data binding. And notice it found those 3 properties that were on my view model because I told the designer that my data context is going to be of type bookshelf view model, right? So I'm going to pick books as the what to bind item source to. I'm going to pick selected item and also bind that to selected book. And I'm going to pick this book editor control, and I'm going to bind its book property to selected book. So I've got my data bound, my UI bound to the different pieces of data that my view model exposes. Now I've got those methods, and I want to call those methods whenever buttons are clicked. Now, a typical way that you might have seen if you've looked at view model patterns and implementations out there is to actually go to your view model, and you have these methods, but in addition, go create properties of type iCommand, because button has a property called command, which is of type iCommand, and use binding that way. However, there's other ways to kind of look at the same problem. Effectively, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just like binding is a declarative element in the XAML. So if I go and show you that. So I've got my list box, and its item source is bound to books. I want to create a similar declarative construct that represents a command that's going to invoke the method when the button is clicked in the UI, in the markup, rather than implementing iCommand properties in my class. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is uncomment this section here. I'll talk about what it does. So in my resources section, I've gone ahead and created a bunch of command objects. Each of these command objects implements iCommand. And iCommand is a very simple interface. It just says execute whatever it represents, and can you execute, so that buttons can go disabled when the command can't be executed. But what I'm doing here is I'm creating a bunch of commands, load command, more command, save command, so on and so forth, that are, the target is the binding, whatever the default binding is. In this case, it happens to be the view model. And the method that I want to invoke is load books, load more books, which correspond to the methods that I have in my view model, right? So now let's go ahead and hook the buttons to the commands, and the commands are in turn at runtime going to invoke the methods on the view model. So again, I'm going to go back to the designer, pick load, and here's the command property on the button. I'm going to say apply resource, and it lists all my commands, right? So the load button goes to load command. Now, what's interesting about the load button, or the load method, is it takes the search text as a parameter, right? And so commands have a command parameter, and I want to bind that to the text of the search text box. So I'll go ahead and apply data binding here, pick an element, pick the search text box, and then I want to bind to the text of the text box, right? So I just bound the load method, load button's command to the load command, and the command parameter to the text of the text box. So whenever that button's clicked, the text of the text box is going to be passed into that load method. Similarly, I'll go and bind each method, each button. This one's the more command. And you can kind of see I'm going to do this for each one of these. Save, share a book. It's not too bad. You have to kind of do each one at a time. Edit command. OK command. And last, cancel command. OK. So at this point, what I've just done are three things. I've told my view what its view model is. At runtime, in the initialized component, I'm creating an instance of my view model and assigning that to the data context. I've bound different parts of my UI to different pieces of data, like the list box to the books collection. And then I bound buttons to commands, which are going to invoke my methods. So now the UI is kind of done, and whoever's working on the UI can continue working on the UI. As the developer, you can now focus on this class here and implement the methods. So I'm just going to copy this or snippet this. Now, one thing you'll notice is this looks almost identical to the code behind, right? And that's intentional, because I actually like to think of viewmodel not as a kind of brand new sophisticated pattern that you have to kind of go learn. It's really a refactoring of your code behind. My code behind was doing search text box.text over here instead of being passed in search text. And in that sense, it was dependent on the UI. But I've just written a method that takes a simple string, and now it is no longer dependent on the UI, but the rest of the logic is identical, right? So if you've written your code behind in a way such that the UI dependencies are minimal, you can almost just refactor your code. So at this point, I should have loading working again. Let's just make sure. OK, so there you go. I've got my loading working. So that was a very simple intro to viewmodel, and I'll come back to do the saving part. One thing now I want to do is kind of go back to the server and now think a little bit about some business rules. I want to apply some authorization and authentication. So the books that I'm seeing here are all books in the book club. And I'm actually implementing the My Bookshelf feature of this application. And so I kind of want to know who the user is. I want to have the user log in and see their books, right? So let's go back to the server where I'm going to implement authentication. Close out some of this stuff. Leave this open. So first thing I'm going to go ahead and do on this bookshelf service is declare intent, right? So we've allowed you to specify that this thing requires authentication. And so now, if the user is not authenticated, all of the methods are going to return, hey, access denied, right? I also want to now declare how to do the authentication. So RIA services doesn't introduce a new authentication mechanism. It builds on top of whatever is there on ASP.NET. So whether it's forms or cookie-based authentication or Windows authentication or some other sort of claims-based authentication or OpenID authentication, what have you, it leverages whatever authentication mechanism you pick. So for this application, what I'm going to go ahead and do is set the authentication mode to forms auth, right? So it's sort of a username password thing that I enter, and it sets up a cookie. So I've set my authentication mode in my application. Now I want to implement authentication. Now, by default, we actually, in RIA services, you can do file new authentication service, and it just works on top of the ASP.NET membership system. How many people have used ASP.NET membership? A few of you. So ASP.NET provides this infrastructure for managing users' roles and user data. And so if you just do file new authentication service, it just builds on top of that, and you just get everything working. Now, for this application, what I wanted to do was kind of show a slightly more advanced possibility that might be interesting to some applications out there. If you remember my data model, I had a class called member, or a table called member, and it's related to different entities over here. Like my book has an owner. Requests and checkouts are done by a member. And so I wanted to use this member as the basis for my list of users in my application, rather than create a separate sort of table that ASP.NET creates, which is the list of users, right? And so we actually allow you to do that very easily. Basically, an authentication service is a domain service, so it derives from authentication service, which derives from domain service. And it has a few methods. Just like I had a getBooks query method, an authentication service has a login method, which returns the logged in, validates the user's credentials and returns a user object. It has a getUser method, which looks at the current user and returns the user object. So what's this user object? This user object is any class that derives from user base, and I can add additional properties to it that I want to track on a given user. So in this particular case, I have display name and member ID, right? And so my authentication service here needs to do whatever data access it wants to do with the backend model and produce that user object. So for example, in validate credentials, I'll go ahead and new up my object context, my entity framework object context, look up a member where the name and password match, and if they match, I'm going to go ahead and create a user and return that, right? And if there's no user that matches, I'm going to return null. which RIA service is going to translate into, hey, invalid credentials, and take care of the sort of the authentication part of the overall scenario. So this is my simple authentication service. All it implements is this sort of, it does the database lookup and producing a user, and RIA services takes care of setting up the authentication cookie and all of that on your behalf. So now that I've defined the authentication I'm using, I've implemented credential validation, I want to actually now use this user object in my code, in my domain service. So let's go here and add a user field to this. So I can go ahead and add a member variable user, which is that user type that I defined. And I want to have a user be passed in my constructor. So the moment I do that, I don't have a parameterless constructor anymore. And so RIA services itself can't instantiate your class because it doesn't know how to get a user object. So, but that's not a problem. What we offer is a pluggable mechanism where you can plug in what's called a domain service factory, which basically has two methods: create a domain service given a type, and dispose or release of a domain service. And so this code's not super interesting, but I just want to point out that there is a point of extensibility that you can use to override how a domain service instance is created, and you can pass in initialization data. In this particular case, when I'm creating a bookshelf service, this factory is going to use the authentication service, get the current user, and pass the current user as the constructor parameter to that bookshelf service. All right? And for those people, I'm not going to get into this, but for those people who've used IOC, like Unity is one of those. There's several. MEF is another thing that you could go use over here, Managed Extensibility Framework, to implement a more generic factory rather than a hard-coded one like I have done over here. So once this factory is in place, the way it gets in place is by you registering it. So I'm setting a static domain service.factory equals this factory that I just wrote. This factory is now going to go ahead and take over creating this, and I'm going to have a user object here. So now that I have this user object, I can go ahead and use it. So I want to go into get books and replace that or filter the books by saying books member ID must equal to user.memberid. So now I just said I want authentication. I require authentication, so I'm guaranteed that I'll have a user here, and I'm using the property, the member ID property of the user, in my query on my domain service. And so this is a very sort of, I think, a very common thing you want to do once you kind of have authentication and authorization, which is actually use the user object in your domain service, right? The currently logged in user. So at this point, if I were to go run this, if I click load now, you'll see I got an error. I didn't handle the error that happens when you call load or when you call any server method, something might fail. I didn't actually handle that. I didn't show that. So I get an error. But it kind of shows that method is no longer accessible because I did not log in. So cancel that. Let's log in. So here's the display name. That user object, when I log in and the validate method returns a user, that user object comes all the way back to the client where you can use the properties of that user and display it in the UI. So now I've got my login going. And if I load books, it loads a different set of books. You'll have to trust me on that. So we have what we have now so far is we have a domain service. We've been using the query method so far. We converted from code behind to view model. So my view model is now working with my domain context on the client, and the UI is bound to the view model. I've implemented basic authentication and authorization on the server and using that user object in the service. So now let's do a little bit of editing. This UI is kind of calling out for some attention. So let's go and do a few things to kind of get ready for editing. Now, when I expose data for editing, you probably don't want to expose data without any rules. You want to define what's valid, right? And so what I'll go ahead and do, which is, why is it not here? Give me just a second. I'm wondering where did. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is annotate the book class on the server with some additional metadata about what's valid, right? And so I'll go ahead and create a book partial class. This is partial to the class that was generated from the entity framework. Go ahead and define a book metadata class which has fields corresponding to the fields that are on the book class. And on top of that, specify some attributes like regular expression, like a ASIN needs to be 10 characters long and an alphanumeric, something like that. Let's save this. Well, I actually have a custom validation rule too, for some reason. So I have a custom validation rule that says a description needs to be meaningful, and so I've written a little bit of code for that. So it's a method that takes a string, and it can do whatever it wants inside the method and return either success, as in the description was meaningful, or it can return a validation result which describes the error that, hey, this description didn't make any sense. Now, what I've done is define this in a class called bookrules.shared.cs. And what happens when I compile this, when I build this, is shared code gets propagated to the client as well. Along with all the metadata intent that I had specified on the server, that gets sent to the client as well. So if you look at this code over here on the client, you'll see under generated code in the data model folder, I have bookrules.share.cs, and it's a read-only copy of the same code that I had on the server. Furthermore, if I go and look at the book class, and let's look at ASIN, you'll see there's a regular expression attribute. And so we took that attribute that you had on the server on the book class and propagated to the corresponding book entity on the client. You'll also notice a couple of other things like required and string length. I didn't actually specify them. Where did they come from? Well, they actually came from my data model. In my database, when I defined my database, I actually had a rule saying that this column is required, this column is at most 10 characters long. And so when you created that entity framework model, that metadata intent from the database was captured into the model, and we look at that model in addition to any rules you specify in your sort of application logic and transfer all of that down to the client. And so the idea is to kind of have most immediate feedback on the client for the end user, so if they make a mistake, they see it immediately, but enforce it at every level. So it's enforced at the client, it's enforced at the middle tier, and certainly the database is going to enforce that it matches the constraints of the schema. So now that I have some metadata defined over here, I want to also define some interesting application logic. So I have an insert book method. I want to do some interesting things there that make sense to do on the server. And remember I said that this was generated code, this is starter code. This is what I mean, that you'd be adding interesting stuff, interesting logic that is specific to your application. So I'm doing two or three things. First, I want to check if the book exists in the book club already. In that case, throw a validation exception saying the book already exists. I also want to go to Amazon and look up that ID and make sure it's a valid book. You saw that error in the demo that I did at the start. And so one of the things I have here with Amazon is I have an Amazon access key and a secret key that I use to sign my request when I send them to Amazon. I'm not going to send that to the client. And so this particular validation rule can only be executed on the server, versus something like regular expression and the description is meaningful, which kind of looks at word count, can certainly be run on the client as well. Right? So I've got some server-side only validation logic over here. And last but not least, when a book is submitted, I want to set its member ID to the currently authenticated user. So I'm using that user.memberid again. I have a couple of errors here. And I need to implement this method, book exists. And it's a simple method here. Go look up in the database whether the book exists. Again, this is something that I couldn't do on the client because I don't have my full database on the client, right? I'm not going to have my full database on the client ever. So this particular piece of logic executes on the server. All right, so we've got my logic over here. Now, one other thing. You've been noticing, I hope you've been noticing, so we have a convention going on. I have get books that returns an iQueryable, and that tells us it's a query method. Anything that returns iQueryable or IEnumerable is a query method. I've got a method called insert book, and the fact that it starts with insert, we also have a few other prefixes like add, for example, that we interpret as an insert method. I've got update book and delete book and so on. Now, some people don't like convention. Some people like convention. I like convention because it keeps my class clean. But I also like my methods to actually make sense, right? So there's a trade-off. I might choose sometimes that I want my method to actually make more sense. So I want to call this share book because that's the intent. That's the sort of the logical sort of meaning of the task. But it's now no longer going to be interpreted as an insert method. So I can go ahead and use configuration. So RIA services kind of gives you convention by default. But if you don't like convention or it doesn't fit your needs, you can switch over and actually configure explicitly as well, right, using attributes. Similarly, delete book, I want to call that unshare book, if that's a word. And I'll call that delete. Oops. Right? And so the client doesn't need to know. All the client cares about is that there is the ability to insert a book, and there's the ability to go delete a book. Right? It doesn't actually care about what the names are. But if I go look at this class, if I go look at the class browser or dock this piece of functionality that is my application, I want it to have meaningful names, right? And I can do that. So let's see. What else do we have to do? We have to actually go implement the client. So let's go to my view model. And I had stubs here, like share book, edit book, commit the editing, cancel the editing, and save books, right? And so these are things that are in my view model. And I had them there because I sketched them. And I realized that those are interesting things that my view model should expose to the UI, and that the UI designer can actually go call into them. But I haven't actually implemented them. So now I'm going to actually go do that. So let's get rid of this. And again, just unhide code that magically just appears. So there's a little bit of code here. So let me set it all up, and then I'll talk about what I just did. So share book is the method that gets called when I click that share a book button. I'm creating a new book, setting the added date to a default, which is today, and calling begin edit on that. That tells the entity now it's going into editing mode, start tracking all changes. And if I call cancel edit, it'll roll back to whenever you call begin edit. So that's what I'm calling begin edit. And I'm setting the selected book to this new book. And if you look at the selected book property from before, it's going to raise a property change, which is going to get picked up by that book editor control. And so now it's going to show this new sort of empty book. And then at some point, I want to click either OK or cancel, right? So let's say I clicked OK. I'm going to take that selected book, validate that book. And I haven't implemented that method yet. We'll get to that. So this is kind of where a view model adds value. So you can go define what it means to go validate a book and encapsulate that inside your view model without the UI designer having to kind of go worry about it. I'll go ahead and validate. And if it succeeds validation, I'll call end edit, which is going to sort of commit all the changes. If the book is not part of the bookshelf context yet, I'm going to go add it to the books collection because it's a new book. If instead it was an edit in the sense that it was already in the bookshelf, I don't need to go ahead and add. It's already in the bookshelf. If I click cancel instead, all I'm going to go ahead and call is cancel edit. And I'm not going to add it to the bookshelf. And if it's an edit scenario, what's going to happen is it's going to roll back all changes you had made since calling begin edit, right? So let me actually go ahead and implement validate. And I hope I have my code over here now. So we'll get back. So here's my book class, and this time it's a partial class on the client. So we generated a book on the client because you had a book on the server. You can add partial code on the server to the server version of the book. I can also write a partial class on the client to add partial code on the client. All right? So here's where I'm going to go do the validation. And I'm going to speed through this just so I can get through the rest of the demo. Couple other things I want to go ahead and do, and I'll talk to them, is I want to show the edit state, like whether it's a new book or modified book. So I have some UI in my XAML, like a new marker, a modified marker, an error marker, and those are bound to the books is new property, is modified property, and has validation errors. And they come from over here. I've added is modified to my book, which is a shortcut for looking at the entity state .modified, is new, and so on and so forth. So let's just run this. I didn't log in. No, something didn't go right. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and enter a book. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip this demo because I kind of already showed this. What's essentially going to happen is when I click OK, my view model is going to get called over here. I can make a whole bunch of changes and then call save books, which calls bookshelf.submit changes. Now, the bookshelf object is tracking all changes that you made, and it's going to take all of those changes, package them up into a change set, and send them all the way back to the server. On the server, the RIA services infrastructure is going to go ahead and dispatch the parts of that change set to the right methods. So share book's going to get called, update book's going to get called, and so on and so forth. Right? So I'm almost done. Let me actually show one demo just as a sneak peek. It's a phone demo, given that phone's an interesting thing today. So imagine that we're having lunch or something, and we're talking about books as colleagues, and I pull out the phone, and I can now hit the same book service. The idea is that I can write my application logic once and actually use it for multiple different clients, whether it's a Silverlight client on the desktop or a mobile client or an Ajax client. I can also surface the list of books as a sitemap if I wanted to do search engine optimization, or I can go surface it as a feed if I want to have an RSS feed for my books. And this is still loading. Still loading. Meanwhile, I'll have all of my code up on my blog. That's coming up now. We'll let it come up, and I'll talk to it. I guess it wants to stay on top. All right, so search for books. Didn't like it. Oops. All right, we'll give this one shot. Oh. No, the browsing books actually doesn't require authentication. But it's not working, and I'm not completely running out of time. So let me actually get to a couple of slides that I did want to talk about. And you'll have all of these slides in code. So to kind of recap, when designing a domain service, some of the things to think about: constrain your queries, think about parameters, think about business rules, like I constrain the list of books to the members' books. Think about result limits in terms of how many books at most a client can go get. Think about specific operations that match your application's semantics, like share book, that kind of thing. use validation to enforce rules, and provide useful experience, kind of like what I showed at the very beginning. Use authorization. We've got, so you can think about validation, authorization, things that you have to put on a service boundary between a client and a server, but think of it as application logic that you model as part of your domain service. Handle errors. I didn't handle the load error, and obviously I saw some errors. So any call like load or submit can fail. When designing your domain services, think about the specific tasks of your application. So this is stuff I unfortunately couldn't get to cover, but you'll have all the content. This is a few related talks. I mentioned search engine optimization. Brad is actually going to be doing a talk tomorrow to show how you can use a domain service from a ASP.NET page to do some server-side rendering and to create sitemaps. And alternate content for search engine optimization. And then there's other talks on Silverlight as well as ViewModel. Today, we're at 8 p.m., we're going to have a meetup of sorts. Colin Blair has a fabulous room over here at 2401. We're going to meet at 8. We can talk about anything. I'm going to be there. Brad's going to be there. And then we're going to head to the party after that. So if anyone's interested in talking about RIA services, seeing some more of the demo in more detail, feel free to come there. My blog is on nikhilk.net. I'll be posting these slides and code over there. In terms of bits, we released an RC that runs on top of Silverlight 4 RC and VS 2010 RC. Our plan is to ship V1 on top of .NET 4 and Silverlight 4. If people are looking for hosted solutions, we have hosters now starting to get on board. So if you Discount ASP and OrcsWeb are a couple of hosters. I'm sure there's others who've actually deployed RIA services, the RC bits, and you can start using them if you're interested. Your one-stop, if you're looking for RIA service information, hpsilverlight.net/RIA services is your starting point. Anything interesting over here? So certainly, if you're building a new sort of line of business application, and if you're using Silverlight, definitely check out RIA services if you haven't already. If you have, like lots of you have already, think about your application design. Think about what you can do inside a domain service to kind of take it to the next level. All right. Well, I'm kind of actually overboard, but I'm going to be here for questions. Let's actually, until we still have the room, anyone can come with the mic and ask questions. To everyone else, thank you.